Okay, I'm going to start recording here. So what's our kind of brief agenda this morning? So first I want to talk about another topic from microeconomics, which is comparative advantage. And those are the few pages, the 5 pages from chapter 2 that I assigned you to look over last night. So we will talk about comparative advantage. After that, we're going to move on to talk about chapter 7 in GDP. We'll finish that, or we will not finish that chapter, but we'll kind of begin to talk about that chapter here this morning. We'll take our usual lunch break, and then this afternoon, we really won't cover any new material. I want to spend a little bit of time maybe reviewing comparative advantage from this morning. I definitely want to spend some time reviewing what we talked about yesterday with regards to supply and demand and the other introductory stuff that we talked about yesterday. And then once we all kind of feel comfortable, we will take the quiz, okay? And so how's the quiz going to work this afternoon? You know, what's going to be on it? Well, the quiz is basically going to be kind of a mixture of short answers and problems, right? So there's going to be no long questions or essays or anything like that, just kind of short answers and some supply and demand problems. And so I'm going to experiment here. We'll see how it works. It may not work for us at all, but I'm going to experiment with doing the quiz via Google Forms. So I don't know if any of you have done Google Forms before in any of your classes, but basically the quiz is going to be in Google Forms. I'll send it to you. You can open up the form, you can fill it out, and then you can send it back to me. And so, like I said, we're going to try this. It may not work, and I'm going to try something else because I've never actually used Google Forms for grading, but I know other people have, and they've had some success with it. So we're going to try it. So anyway, we'll talk more about that, but that's going to be kind of the process. And you know, the quiz is going to be a short quiz. It's basically like a 15-minute quiz. I'll give you up to a half an hour, which really should be more than enough time, I think, for all of you to complete the quiz. And so we'll do that this afternoon. And so if you have any questions about what we talked about yesterday in terms of all the material we talked about yesterday, or if you just want to, there's certain questions you want to review, if you did some of the questions from the end of the chapter and you were a little confused about any of them, we will definitely have time this afternoon to talk about that, all right? Okay, so any questions before we jump all in here? Okay, well, hearing none, let me make sure I'm not muted, because I have done that before. I have you all muted and then say, hearing no questions, I'll move on. But okay, so hearing no questions, let's talk about comparative advantage, right? So this is also part of our microeconomic review, right? Well, it's not review for all of you, but for some of you, it's review. So really the two big microeconomic topics that I wanted to talk about before we get into the meat of the macro stuff is to talk about supply and demand and to talk about this idea of comparative advantage. Okay, so comparative advantage is in chapter 2. Remember, it's only pages, I assigned you, it's only pages 32 through 37. There's a lot of other stuff in chapter 2. I mean, if you read it, good for you. Hopefully you learned something, but you will not be graded on the other material from chapter 2, right? I'm really just interested in this topic of comparative advantage. So why is comparative advantage important for us to talk about? Well, comparative advantage is important for us to talk about because it gets to this very fundamental question in economics. What do people gain from trade? And just like comparative advantage helps us understand what do people gain from trade, it also helps us understand this broader macroeconomic question of what do countries gain from trade? So what do people gain from trade? What do countries gain from trade? Why is trade such an important part of well-being? And what comparative advantage teaches us is that the key to understanding trade is one word: specialization. Why trade is so fundamentally important to our well-being has to do with this idea of specialization. How do we get better at things over time? We specialize in what we do best, right? Through specialization, each of us specializing in what we do best, that's how we become more productive and are able to make more goods and services and eventually earn greater income over time, right? So specialization, that is a word you're going to hear me use many, many times this morning because it is so fundamental to understanding so many questions in economics, right? Is the benefits that we get from specialization. Now, to kind of understand why specialization is so important, let me give you kind of a hypothetical question. Should LeBron James mow his own lawn? Should LeBron James mow his lawn? Zach, you're shaking your head. No, you don't think LeBron James should mow his lawn. Why not?
That's not what he's good at. He should play basketball.
But you know what? I'm betting that LeBron James would be a pretty good lawnmower.
Yeah, he's athletic. He's definitely athletic enough to get out there and mow the yard for an hour, yeah.
I bet he could be damn good. I bet
Maybe 10.
At mowing his lawn. So why shouldn't he mow his lawn if he's really good at it?
Oh, because then he couldn't play basketball.
Right. And he might be good at mowing the lawn. He might be good playing basketball. But the question is not what you're good at. The question is, where are you best, right? In other words, where is the difference between LeBron James and a regular person, the greatest? It's not in mowing the lawn, it's in playing basketball, right? So what should LeBron James do? He should specialize in playing basketball and then pay somebody else to mow his lawn, right? That's the key to specialization. So the key to specialization is not thinking about what you're good at. Because listen, there are some people that are good at everything, right? I know people who are, my partner is a good lawyer. She's also an excellent typist. But that doesn't mean that she should be typing everybody's papers, right? I mean, you have to specialize in what you are best at. And so that's the key to specialization. And so that's why individuals benefit from trade. That even if you are one of these naturally gifted people that can do everything well, you can still benefit from specializing in what you do best. I don't know if this is a book that is read anymore in high schools, or if any of you are familiar with the book Robinson Crusoe, or have heard about the book Robinson Crusoe. It's a book that was written, late 1600s. It's quite an old book. And basically, you probably know the even if you have never heard of Robinson Crusoe, you kind of know the basic plot. So basically, Robinson Crusoe is stranded on this desert island, and he's all alone. And so he basically has to fend for himself. He has to kind of make everything that he consumes in life. Now, the thing about Robinson Crusoe is he's a pretty sharp guy. He's pretty smart. And so he's actually able to do this. If you guys haven't read Robinson Crusoe, you have probably seen Gilligan's Island, right? Gilligan's Island is the same idea, right? The professor's pretty damn smart guy. He can make radios from coconuts and all this other stuff. But the fact of the matter is, all the stuff that he makes is still pretty shitty, right? Why? Because he doesn't have the kind of specialized knowledge to make, things as good as they could be. And quite honestly, none of us do. None of us do. It's weird to think about this, but it is true. There's not a single human on this planet that knows how to make a pencil, right? There is not a single person on this planet that knows how to make a pencil. Because if you think about even something as simple as a pencil, all of the different processes and inputs that go into making that pencil, nobody knows every step of that, right? There's not one single person that knows how you mine the carbon, how you get it from here to there, how you make it into the little shapes, how in the hell they get it into the wood, how you cut down the wood, how you make it into an octagonal, how you get the paint and take the rubber. I mean, even something as simple as a pencil is an incredibly complex tool. How do we get these incredibly complex tools? It's because nobody has to know how to do all of it. We just have a lot of people that know how to do little bits of it, and they get very good at making those little bits of it. That is basically the key to getting rich, right? And as we're going to talk about, as we move into this question about why countries are rich and why countries are poor, countries that are rich specialize more, right? Specialize more. The more that you specialize, the more productive you become. And so, in some sense, that's what we're doing in college, right? We are specializing, right? We're trying to develop specific skills that we have that are valuable in the marketplace. This is not just the reason why individuals gain from trade, though. Specialization doesn't just help individuals. Countries as a whole can benefit from specialization, okay? So even though the US economy is a big economy, it still gains from specialization. So let's think about an example here. A more concrete example about how countries gain from specialization. Okay. So here's our example. So let's say that we have, obviously this is an extremely oversimplified or simplified example, right? So I wouldn't necessarily say this is a realistic example, but we want to keep it simple because we want to illustrate hopefully what's a pretty obvious point when we get to the end of this. But let's assume that we have two countries and these two countries only make two goods, okay? So let's say that we have a US worker and we have a Mexican worker. And we have two goods, computers and shirts, okay? So we have two countries, two goods. Now let's say that the average US worker could make in a day 10 computers, or they can make 100 shirts. The average Mexican worker could make 4 computers or 50 shirts. So what do we observe here about the workers in these two countries? What's true about the US worker?
Probably use more technology to make things more efficient, to make more product.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of reasons, right? They have more technology, they have more physical capital to work with, they have more human capital, most likely. But yeah, we don't even have to get into the reasons about why. Right now, we don't have to get into the reasons about why the US worker is more productive. We just see here in this example that the US worker is more productive at making both goods, right? In other words, the US worker has absolute advantage in both goods. Absolute advantage just simply means who makes more. And so, yes, the US has absolute advantage over Mexico in both of these goods. Just like LeBron James would have absolute advantage over me in playing basketball and mowing lawns. But does the fact that the US worker have absolute advantage in both of these goods mean that the US can't gain from trade with Mexico? No. The US can still gain from trade. How? By specializing in what they do best. Not what they do better, specializing in what you do best. And that's what we call comparative advantage. Not absolute advantage, but comparative advantage. Comparative advantage, who is the low opportunity cost? Producer of a good. Who is the low opportunity cost producer of a good? What do we mean by what do we mean by opportunity cost? Opportunity cost is just what you give up to get something. Okay. Opportunity cost is what you give up to get something. So it's opportunity cost is a little bit different than the price of a good, or it can be different than the price of the good, right? It's what you give up to do something. So let's think about, for instance, what's the opportunity cost of going to college? Who can help me with this? Jonah, maybe you can help me think through what's the opportunity cost of going to college? Like, what do you give up when you go to college?
A lot of money.
Right. So you give up tuition, right? That's definitely opportunity cost of college.
You give up your time where you can learn a trade or something.
Right. You give up your time. Particularly, yeah, you could learn a trade or you could go work at McDonald's, right? In other words, as Faith says here in the chat, those 2 to 4 years that you could be spending in the workforce, that is an additional opportunity cost of going to college, right?
Right.
Is your room and board an opportunity cost?
No, isn't the money that I spend on room and board an opportunity cost? Because I could have been spending it on something else.
Yeah, but you're still going to need to eat, and you're still going to need to find a place to sleep, right? So,
Right.
Probably your room and board is not an opportunity cost, right? Because it's not an additional expense for you to go to college. So, right. So that's what but basically, opportunity cost is really thinking more broadly about what you have to give up to get something. So let's use that idea of opportunity cost to figure out for each of these countries, what's the opportunity cost for them of making each of these goods, okay? So what's the opportunity cost for the US of making a computer? And what's the opportunity cost of making a shirt? So let's think about this. Opportunity cost is what you give up to get something. What does the US give up to get a computer? If a US
10 shirts.
Yeah, exactly. They give up 100 shirts for every 10 computers, right? You give up 100 shirts for every 10 computers, or 10 shirts per computer. That's the opportunity cost of a US computer. What's then the opportunity cost of a US shirt? As Sunny says in the chat, 1 over 10 computers, right? In this simple example, these are just inverses of each other. So to get a computer, you have to give up 10 shirts. To get a shirt, you give up 1/10 of a computer. How about for Mexico? Okay. What does Mexico give up to make a computer? Well, they give up 50 shirts for every 4 computers. Right? 50 shirts for every 4 computers, or 12 and a half shirts per computer. What then is the opportunity cost of a Mexican shirt? just the inverse of that, 1 over 12.5. Everybody seeing where I'm getting these numbers, right? Once again, the key here to understanding this is what you give up relative to what you get. What you give up relative to what you get. So what we've done here, excuse me, what we've done here is we've calculated the opportunity cost for each of the countries for each of the goods. Now we can figure out who has comparative advantage, because who has comparative advantage? It's the country that's the low opportunity cost producer of the good. So when it comes to computers, who has the low opportunity cost in producing computers?
The United States.
The US, right? The US has comparative advantage in computers because they're the low opportunity cost producer. How about shirts? Mexico, right? Mexico is the low opportunity cost producer of shirts, so they should produce shirts. And you might be asking, how is it that Mexico has an advantage in making shirts? Don't they produce less than the United States? But remember, how much you produce isn't the question. The question is, who's the low cost producer, right? So the thing that's going on here in this example, one way to think about this is the US is so good at making computers that it should not spend its time making shirts. Even though it's good at making shirts, it should not spend its time making shirts. It should spend its time doing what it does best, and that's making computers. Once again, think about that LeBron James playing basketball, mowing his lawn, right? Yeah, LeBron James is pretty good mowing his lawn, but he should spend his time doing what he does best. Same for the US. The US is particularly good at making computers. That's what they should specialize in. Mexico is relatively good at making shirts, so that's what they should specialize in. What then should happen between these countries? The US makes computers, Mexico makes shirts, and they trade, right? They trade. And very importantly, they both gain from trade. To think about how they both gain from trade, maybe the best way to think about this is for both countries that gain from trade, what has to be true? Like for instance, let's say that they sell computers, right? What's got to be true about the price of a computer for both of these countries to gain from trade? Well, we know from our example that the US is going to make computers, right? And how much does it cost them? It costs them 10 shirts to make a computer. So what price would be good for the US to trade computers? Any price above 10 shirts would be good for the US, right? Any price above 10 shirts would be a good trade for the US. What about Mexico? Mexico's going to buy computers, right? They can make it themselves for 12.5 shirts. So what price will be beneficial for them? Any price that's less than 12.5 shirts. So what can we say about the price that's mutually advantageous? The price that is mutually advantageous is any price between 10 shirts and 12.5 shirts. That would benefit both countries. Remember that trade has to be mutually advantageous. It has to benefit both parties. If it doesn't benefit both parties, it's not trade, it's a mugging, right? So trade has to be voluntary, right? It has to be voluntary. It has to benefit both parties. So here in this example, what's going to happen between the US and Mexico is they will negotiate a price, right? A price that is both beneficial to the US and beneficial to Mexico. We don't, from this example, we can't say exactly what that price is, but we can say it's got to be in this range, right? It has to be somewhere between 10 shirts and 12 and a half shirts for it to be advantageous to both countries. So here is the key insight, that a country can be better at producing everything and still gain from trade. Why? Because of the power of specialization. Even a country that is good at producing everything can benefit from specializing, right? And so yesterday we talked about Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. And so, you know, as I said yesterday, and as you can tell from the title of this book, what was Smith's key question? Why is it that some countries are richer than others? Why is it that some countries are richer than others? And basically, Smith saw that in his opinion, what makes a country rich is two things. They specialize and then they trade in markets. Specialization in trade, that's what makes a country rich. The more that you specialize and that the more that you trade, that is the fundamental driving factor of increases in wealth. So Smith in his Wealth of Nations basically argues that, yeah, if you think about something like a pencil is a great example of where wealth comes from, right? Because what have we done with a pencil? We've created actually a fairly complicated piece of technology that is very, very cheap, right? That has dramatically increased the standards of our living, right? We don't think about a pencil as being something that great, but I mean, it's one of the millions of different objects we use every day that's relatively easy to obtain, right? That has increased and improved our standards of living. We don't have to write in the dirt with a stick because of things like pencils, right? How in the world do we get something like a pencil? By people specializing in what they do best and then trading, right? And so, you know, once again, it's amazing that nobody in the world knows how to make a pencil. But somehow the fact that many people know little parts of making a pencil, and then by trading through markets, what do we end up with? Pencils, right? It's really kind of an amazing technology, right? Zach says the thermos is by far the best invention ever created. Well, you might be right? And what's true about a thermos? There is no single inventor of a thermos, right? It is a large collection of small innovations driven by people who specialize and then share those ideas through trade, right? That's the key. That's what makes rich countries rich, according to Adam Smith. You take specialization, you maximize it through markets, that's how you get rich. And it's not just how individuals get rich, it's also how countries get rich, right? So I just want to show you, this is this is a figure from your book, I believe. Hold on. For some reason this screen share never really works quite right. Here is a graph of looking at, on the horizontal axis, how rich a country is relative to the US. And on the vertical axis, looking at how much of their exports are in clothing. And what do we see? Countries that are poor specialize more in clothing, and countries here that are richer specialize less in clothing. Why would this be? Well, you know, it's quite simply because clothing is not a particularly specialized industry. It doesn't require a lot of human capital. It doesn't require a lot of physical capital. It's something that people with very little education can be involved in doing. And so what are these countries, what are poor countries able to do? Through trade, they're able to specialize in these industries that meet them where they are in terms of their development, right? So, you know, for instance, Cambodia, a relatively poor country, it has very little chance to compete on the global computer market, but it has a good opportunity to compete in the global clothing market, right? Same for countries like Honduras and Bangladesh. Somehow, many people believe that Cambodia and Honduras and Bangladesh are being hurt by the fact that they are trading in these what we would call lower value-added industries. The fact of the matter is that over the last 20 years, Bangladesh has doubled its income. It's become twice as rich over the last 20 years, largely because this has given them some access, created jobs, created wages, right? Created an access point for them to the global economy. And what can they do? They can sell, kind of like in this example, they can sell shirts for computers, right? The interesting thing is, if you looked at this, if you had a similar graph of this 40 years ago, who would be the countries, anybody have any idea who were the countries 40 or 50 years ago that specialized the most in exporting clothing? Floyd says China. Exactly right. South Korea would have been another country. Vietnam, right? These are countries that were much, much poorer than they are today. How have South Korea and China, and to a lesser extent, Vietnam, gotten richer over the last 40 years? Exactly by doing this, by specializing in low value added goods like clothing, but over time, right? Increasing their know-how, increasing their technology, attracting more physical capital, and moving on to more complex goods, right? Moving up that technology ladder. So, you know, this is part of the reason why economists are so convinced that trade is a good thing, because we just have seen it play out over and over again. That one way that countries can move from being poor to rich is through trade, because it allows you to specialize in what you do best, right? It allows you to increase your productivity and specialize in what you do best. Now, having given you all the pitch here, that trade is such an important thing, you might be asking yourself this question: well, if trade is such a great thing, then why are so many people against it? If trade is such a good thing, why are so many people against it? Right? I mean, I'm sure we are all familiar with Donald Trump and the populist backlash against globalization and trade that's taken place, not just in the US. You can't blame this on Donald Trump. This is something that's taken place across different countries, right? England and Brexit, right, is a kind of a similar phenomena where countries have essentially rebelled against international trade. And it's not just conservatives, right? Many liberals, right, including Bernie Sanders, are extremely skeptical about the value of trade. Why is trade so controversial? Well, I mean, I think there's a few reasons, but the most obvious reason is that while trade benefits the entire economy, in other words, trade is beneficial in the aggregate. But if you look at individuals, there are winners and losers in trade. So trade overall is beneficial for a society and an economy. But when you look at the individual level, it creates winners and losers. So let's go back to this example here that we talked about a little bit ago with the US and Mexican worker. So what happens if the US and Mexico move to a free trade zone? Well, as we talked about, the US is going to make computers and Mexico is going to make shirts. And in this example I talked about, this example is not particularly realistic. I have a US worker who can make a shirt or make a computer. Doesn't make any difference. They can make one or the other, right? But what's true in reality? In reality, people are trained to make computers or they're trained to make shirts, right? Or some areas of the country are making shirts, like in North Carolina, and other areas of the country are making computers, like in California. So if the US moves to a free trade zone with Mexico, what's going to happen to those workers who are making shirts in the United States? They're going to lose their job, right? They're going to lose their job. What are they going to have to do? They're going to have to be retrained to make computers. They might have to move to a different part of the country. They're going to have to give up a lot of their lives. And that's costly, right? So in this example that I talked through in class, I kind of talked through this like there was no cost to moving between making shirts and making computers. But in the real world, there are costs associated with moving from making one good to making another. So if the US has a free trade agreement with Mexico, as in this example, who benefits? Well, computer workers benefit a lot, right? Because now their jobs are set, right? There's going to be big demand for making computers in the United States. US consumers will benefit, right? Because US consumers are now going to pay less for shirts. That's great. So a lot of people will benefit. But what about the people who lose? They lose, and they lose a lot. And so what do they have when it comes to the political process? What are their incentives? Their incentives are to spend a lot of money and to vote on this one single issue. So if any of you have taken a political science class, you might be familiar with this idea of what they call special interest politics. Special interest politics really refers to voting on one single issue, right? Having one issue, which becomes important. And special interest politics are most likely when the benefits of a policy are highly dispersed, but the costs are highly concentrated. When that happens, the losers have an incentive to block the policy, right? the users have an incentive to block the policy. And, quite honestly, that's the situation that we have when it comes to international trade. Who benefits from globalization? Well, I would make the argument that pretty much everybody in the US benefits from globalization, right? Whether you make computers or you're in the IT industry or you're in any of the number of industries, whether you're an Iowa farmer who benefits from globalization, right? Almost everybody benefits from globalization in one way or another. Sometimes in big ways and sometimes just in small ways, in the sense that we can go down to Walmart and buy a lot of things that are very cheap, right? So all of us benefit from globalization, but some of us also experience very big costs associated with globalization, right? That person that makes shoes in North Carolina, that person that is involved in the coal industry in West Virginia, right? Those people are losing their jobs, right? Sometimes because of globalization, but oftentimes just because of technology, they're losing their jobs. And so because they lose so much, they have a lot of incentive to try to block the policy. And, that I think explains a lot of what's going on when we talk about trade in this country, right? Is that, the special interest politics, the people who lose a lot. Economists argue that the solution is that we need to think about more policies in which the winners help the losers through things like job retraining or things like wage subsidies or, many of you might be familiar with this idea of a universal income. Where the government basically guarantees everybody an income every month to cushion the blow of job losses associated with things like globalization. Many other countries do these things much better than the US. And not surprising, free trade is much more popular in these countries, right? where the government purposely invokes policies that make sure that the winners help the losers, free trade becomes more popular. But part of the reason why free trade is so unpopular in the US is that we really don't have government policy that does many of these things, right? We just simply don't, right? Particularly in things like job retraining, which is much more active and involved in many countries. The US spends almost no money on job retraining, right? I mean, really the only kind of job training that the US spends money on is undergraduate education, right? A 4-year undergraduate education, where the government does support that in some ways. But when it comes to like 2-year technical colleges or just more straightforward job retraining, right? Even of a more technical matter, the government spends almost no money on this. What did I read the other day? That basically every year, the US government is spending about $160 billion on undergraduate education in the US, and it spends about $1 billion on technical training, right? I mean, those numbers don't make much sense, right? And so, this is why a lot of people hate trade, is because they have a lot to lose. I'll also say another reason, can't spell. Right? Quite honestly, another reason that trade is unpopular is that there's a lot of scapegoating that goes on. And you all probably know what I mean by scapegoating, which is meaning finding a convenient target to blame. So for instance, a lot of people lose their jobs because of technology. right? Um, I was talking about the people who mine coal in West Virginia. They're not really losing their job from international trade and globalization. They're losing their job because of technology and because of global warming, right? Which is forcing technological innovation. But you can't blame the environment. You can't blame technology. And so what happens often in the political spectrum? We blame China, right? We blame other countries, right? We somehow argue that it's trade with other countries that's at fault, when in fact, many times it's just technology. And the fact that in a capitalist economy, we always have an evolutionary environment where some industries are dying and some industries are growing, right? That is always going to happen, and that's a good thing. But in this political age, a lot of that, kind of natural evolution of industries dying and industries growing, it's all being blamed on globalization, right? In some sense, because it's easier to scapegoat the other, right? The other meaning something as not American. And so I think unfortunately, that's a lot of what's of contributing to the unpopularity of international trade nowadays in the US. So what we see here is, when you talk about trade, we see that trade is right at the intersection between economics and politics, which is a lot of what we talk about in this class, right? I mean, there's an economics aspect of it. And so, maybe we'll talk about this in another way. When you think about questions about policy, many policymakers break the questions into what we call normative questions and positive questions. Normative questions have to do with how the world should work. Positive questions, or actually, I'm sorry, I have this backwards. Why did I do that? Apologize for that. Normative questions, are about how the world actually works. Positive questions are about how the world should work. Right? And so one of the things I think you'll see in this class as we go along is that where the real value in economics is, I think economics can help us think about both of these kind of questions. But in general, economics is better at helping us think about positive questions. In other words, how the world should work, right? But when it comes to the way that the world actually works, this is where politics comes in, right? Because politics in many ways is how we actually try to implement, how we try to get to the answers of these positive questions. And in many ways, our political structures and the way that we conduct our politics prohibit us from making the world act as if economists believe that it should be acting, right? So to put this in another way, sometimes economics can be a bit utopian, right? And that's not to say that it's a bad thing, but it is to say that economists generally find it easier to talk about the way that the world should work. But when it gets to the way that the world actually works, well, that's a very messy business. And there you need to understand some economics, but you also need to understand some politics. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to say about comparative advantage in chapter 2. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? One of the things I'll do this afternoon is maybe we'll work through another comparative advantage problem this afternoon, just to make sure that we kind of understand some of the basic concepts. So we'll come back and kind of review that a little bit this afternoon. But okay, well, if there's no other questions, let's take a break for, let's say, about 7 minutes. So let's come back at 10 o'clock. And then we're going to talk a little bit about GDP, okay? Okay, see you in a couple minutes. All right, so as you come back, if you're a 70s person, give me a thumbs up. We're going to see how many of you are 70s versus medievals, or in your reactions on your in your Zoom. All right. Yeah, as you all come back, if you're a 70s person, give a thumbs up in your reactions.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm not seeing, how many thumbs up am I seeing? I'm seeing a few. I should see more. You think the 70s have it, Sonny? I think you're exactly right. The sample group is definitely biased. But which way? You think younger people are more into this medieval garb? What do you
No, I
think?
actually think younger people are more into like the 70s. So I'm like, this is this totally, the medieval guys are just, they have a lost cause,
See, I was actually thinking younger people were more into the medieval stuff because of Game of Thrones. So, yeah, I don't know.
We said it would look awesome, like if sports teams wore like medieval gowns. Can you imagine? That would be so cool. Like you're out to enjoy a game of lacrosse and they're out there in the little gowns,
Yeah, chainmail, right? You baseball players could be like play with metal helmets like the conquistadors or something instead of your regular batting helmets. I think that would be awesome. I think that would be absolutely awesome. So
Not for baseball. I think the 70s afro would act as the helmet. Ball would just get stuck in there.
That is true. I mean, undoubtedly, that is one of the best things about the 70s, right?
I think the 70s, it's like more likely to make a comeback too. Like I like feel like that would happen more than likely than the medieval stuff.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're right, because I'm definitely more of a Saturday Night Fever guy than I am a Game of Thrones guy. So yes, right. I could get into wearing some platform shoes, and in fact, if you see any pictures of me as a kid, I'm often wearing a polyester jumpsuit as a kid. I'm not going to show you those pictures, but yes, they're out there. So, I've been trained in 70s garb, so I think I could slip back into it. So, all right. Well, let's talk a little bit about Chapter 7 here in GDP. So we're going to kind of move on to the macro stuff, right? Yesterday, this morning, so far we've been kind of talking about, as I said, microeconomic topics of supply and demand, comparative advantage. So what we want to talk about here now is get into what this class is about, right? Which is macro. And we're going to begin by talking about GDP and inflation. And so basically, we're going to begin our discussion of macro by talking about the data of macroeconomics.
Could you share your screen for us, please?
Yeah. Thank you. Forgot. Okay. So we're going to begin here our discussion of macroeconomics by talking specifically about the data of macroeconomics, particularly how do we measure things that we're interested in. And so in Chapter 7, we're going to talk about how we measure aggregate income and inflation. And in Chapter 8, we're going to talk about how we measure unemployment. The next couple of days, we'll be kind of focusing on the more quantitative aspects of economics, specifically, how do we measure these things that we're very interested in, right? Aggregate income, inflation, and unemployment, right? These are things that we're interested in, but of course, these are empirical questions about what the inflation rate is, what the unemployment rate is, what aggregate income is. And so we want to understand how exactly economists understand these. Very importantly, one of the things that we're going to talk about here in the next couple of chapters is that all data is biased. There is no such thing as a perfect data that tells you everything you need to know. Now, to say that data is biased does not mean that it's not useful. It does not mean that it's not useful, but you have to understand its limits. That is the key to what we call at Cornell quantitative literacy, right? In other words, understanding quantitative data is not just about being able to calculate some numbers, right? Or you know, do some algebra and calculate a percent change. That is not what we're interested in. What we are interested in is, can you actually understand what the data is telling us, what the data can tell us, and very importantly, what the data can't tell us, how the data might be biased, and how then you have to incorporate that bias into your interpretation of the data. Because there is never, and this is not just true in economics, this is just true in general, there is never one source of data that's going to tell you everything you need to know about a question, right? So you have to understand what data you have, what it can tell you, what it can't tell you, how it might be biased, and then how you have to kind of adjust for that bias if you're going to use it in decision making. And so that, I think, is crucial. That is the key component to quantitative literacy, is understanding your data, what's its limits, what's its biases. And so that's what we're going to be doing here the next couple of chapters as we talk about these important questions of how do we measure aggregate income, how do we measure inflation, how do we measure unemployment. So let's begin with our measure of aggregate income. And that is gross domestic product, otherwise known as GDP. Okay. So you have probably heard of GDP, or at least had it mentioned. You may or may not be familiar that GDP is just an acronym for gross domestic product. Gross domestic product actually measures three things at once. It measures aggregate income, but it also measures aggregate output. And finally, it measures aggregate expenditure. How in the world can one piece of data measure three things at one time? How's that possible? Any ideas? How can one thing measure three things at one time?
Is it because there's different ways to calculate the GDP? So like you can use different, I guess maybe formulas might be the right word to find the GDP, so that helps you find some of these things?
Well, that, as we're going to talk about, there are different ways that you can measure GDP, right? Or break GDP down. But I don't think that answers the question of how we measure three things at once. My advice to you is don't think too hard about this. Sunny says, I think if one is reflective of the other, like total income may explain total expenditure too. Yeah, particularly if they're equal. That's how GDP measures three things at once. Why? Because these three things are equal to each other. Aggregate income is equal to aggregate output is equal to aggregate expenditure. The key here is aggregate, meaning total. So listen, is it true for you as a college student that your income equals your output equals your expenditure? Absolutely not, right? In fact, all of you are a situation where you have essentially zero income and zero output and large expenditure, right? But how is it that you can have zero income and large expenditure? Because there's somebody else that has income that's greater than their expenditure. There's somebody else that's paying for you, either your parents by giving you money or the financial system that's lending you money. So what has to be true in the aggregate? In the aggregate, all spending has to come from somebody's income. And where does everyone's income come from? Somebody's output, right? So in other words, it has to be the case by definition that total income is equal to total output is equal to total expenditure. These have to be equal. To put this another way, or maybe to think about this another way, think about that desert island, right? Or no, think about Gilligan's Island, right? Right, so we have this island. What happens if Gilligan gets on this island? Well, Gilligan's output is going to be the same as his income. It's going to be the same as his expenditure if he's just alone on this island. What happens then if the captain and Marianne and the professor get on this island? Well, now for individuals, their income can be different than their output, and their output can be different from their expenditure. But what's going to be true for the group? For the group, total income has got to equal total output. It's got to equal total expenditure. And so you can have the 6 or 7 people on Gilligan's Island, or you can have the 330 million people in the US economy. It's got to be the case that all expenditure has to be paid by somebody. It has to be somebody's income. And somebody's income has got to be linked to output. So when we talk about GDP, we can refer to it as a measure of aggregate income, but we can also refer to it as a measure of aggregate output and a measure of aggregate expenditure. Don't be confused by this, because sometimes I will talk about aggregate output and then I might in the next sentence say aggregate expenditure. They're both measured by GDP, right? They're both measured by GDP. So GDP is very useful for us in that because these concepts are the same, or they have to be equal to each other. They're not the same, but they have to be equal to each other. Because they have to be equal to each other, one statistic can measure all three, and that's what GDP is. So let's talk about the definition of GDP. And this definition is long, but actually GDP is a pretty simple idea. It's not a particularly complicated measure, at least in theory. In practice, it gets a little complicated, but in theory, it's actually pretty simple. So GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a period of time. Okay, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a period of time. let's talk about these one at a time. And let me kind of ask you, I think the easiest way to kind of think about this definition is just to break it down phrase by phrase. So GDP is the market value. Market value. Nevaeh, am I saying your name right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Nevaeh. What do you think we mean by market value? How would you determine the market value of something? If you owned a house and I said, tell me the market value of your house, what would you do?
Oh, just like the cost, not really the cost, but like the value of your house, of your product. Like,
How do you think, how would you figure that out? Or like, let's make it even simpler. Let's say that you had some old Star Wars figures that you wanted to sell. How would you figure out the market value of those Star Wars figures?
you go to like an expert that knows about that.
Yeah, and what that expert's going to do is he or she is going to go on eBay and say, what's the market selling it for, right? And so when we talk about market value, we're talking about market prices. So GDP not just measures the quantity of things, but it also has to incorporate the prices of these things based on what they're selling at in the market. So for instance, orange juice is included in GDP. You have to figure out both the quantity of orange juice that's produced, but also the price of orange juice, right? That gives you the market value. So market value means we have to think about prices. Why do we have to incorporate prices in GDP? Because if we didn't incorporate prices, it would not make any sense, right? Would it make sense to say, well, I have an economy that makes 1,000 oranges and 10 cars, so my GDP is 1,010? That number doesn't make any sense because we know a car is worth a lot more than an orange. So essentially what we're doing here is we're weighing each good by its market price to say that goods that have higher prices should weigh more in GDP. Goods that have lower prices should weigh less in GDP. So market value, we have to use market prices. Goods and services. So what's included in GDP is not just physical goods, right? So services are included in GDP as well. Haircuts, GDP. Babysitting, GDP, right? Tuition, right? GDP, right? These are services that are provided and they have to be included in GDP. If we did not include services, we would be missing most of GDP. As we're going to talk about more in a few minutes, the US economy now is roughly about 70% services and about 30% physical goods. So that is a dramatic change in the nature of the US economy. And in fact, we'll talk about this change many times over this block because it explains a lot of the things that's going on in the US economy, is this movement from physical goods to services as being the primary thing that we produce. Final. We only want to include final goods, not intermediate goods. We only want to include final goods, not intermediate goods. Why? We want to avoid double counting. In other words, we want to avoid counting things twice. So think about, for instance, a tire that's put on a new car. Should we include the price of that new car in GDP and then also the value of that tire? No, because then we're really counting the value of that tire twice. We're counting it once as the tire, and then the second time as a part of that price of the car. So what do we want to include in GDP? Only the car. Only the car, because that's the final good. It's not the intermediate good. The idea is simple. Now, in practice, it gets a little bit more complicated, right? Because tires can be final goods as well, right? You buy a new car and you drive off the lot and you hit a nail and you pop a tire, and then you have to go to the garage to get a new tire. That new tire now is a final good. So the new tire you put on your car should be included in GDP. But the tire that came with the car should not be included in GDP, right? So as I said, in practice, this can get a little complicated, but I think the idea is a pretty simple one. We only want to include final goods, not intermediate goods, right? Not intermediate goods. The most important word of this whole definition is produced, because GDP focuses on production. If nothing is produced, then it is not included in GDP. If nothing is produced, it is not included in GDP. So what does this mean? This excludes a lot of things. For instance, goods that you resell, not included in GDP. Right? If I start selling part of my record collection, that is not going to get included in GDP. Why? Because, well, when those records were produced, they were included in GDP, but they're not going to be included again when I resell them. So we don't want to have any sort of resale goods, right? No resale goods. No transfer payments. Anything that involves just a transfer of money from one person to another is not included in GDP. If your grandma sends you $10 for your birthday, that's not included in GDP. If the government sends you a Social Security check, that's not included in GDP. If the government sends you a stimulus check, that's not included in GDP. If I borrow money from Logan, that's not included in GDP, right? Why? Because if I borrow money from Logan, Logan gives me money and then I'll pay him back in the future. But nothing has been produced. We are just transferring money. So anything that involves just the transfer of money doesn't get included, right? It doesn't get included. So this can be a tricky one, right? This can be a tricky one. Something else that's not being included is that GDP does not put any value on resources that are not used, right? So here, what I'm trying to say is, like, for instance, what value does GDP place on a forest? It places no value. It's not included in GDP. Now, if you take that forest and you cut it down and you make lumber, then it's included in GDP, right? But until you use it, it's not actually included in GDP, right? It's not actually included in GDP. Once again, because nothing is being produced. Produced is the most important word. And just so you understand kind of why this focus on production, actually the history of GDP is an interesting one. GDP actually was developed as a means for planning during World War II. So in order to prosecute the war, the US government said, listen, we need to have an idea of how much goods and services we produce. And that's where GDP comes from. So, you have to think about it in some sense as a relic of war planning, right? And hence the focus on production. Next, within a country's borders. Meaning only location matters. Only location matters. So nationality does not matter when it comes to GDP. Which auto manufacturer contributes the most to US GDP? Toyota. Toyota is the biggest auto manufacturer in the United States. It does not make any difference that Toyota is a Japanese company. They produce more cars in the United States. They're the biggest contributor to GDP, right? That's just the way it is, right? So in some sense, this is really necessary given our increasingly globalized economy where goods are produced all over the world. As we're going to talk about, though, this creates some confusion, and quite honestly is one of the limits of GDP, is by only focusing on nationality, it doesn't always capture what's truly going on when we talk about things like imports and exports, right? And I'll explain this more in a little bit. But for right now, the most important thing for us to know is only location matters. Nationality does not matter. And then finally, the last part of this, over a period of time. Usually we think about GDP per year, right? GDP per year, right? So it's the amount of goods and services produced within a period of time. Okay. So as I said, GDP is a pretty simple definition. The idea is pretty simple. In practice, it can be complicated because in an economy like the US, you've got millions of goods, and trying to find the market value of all these goods and services can be complicated. But in theory, it's pretty simple. Sunny, Sunny asked in the chat, is domestic labor like childcare part of GDP? Are there services which aren't priced apart from daycare? And I mean services at home. So yes, this is a very good question, something I was going to talk about here in a couple of minutes, but we can talk about it now. Remember, our definition of GDP focuses on market value. It's got to be sold in a market. So things that you produce at home are not included in GDP, right? If you take care of your own kids, that's not included in GDP. If you have a garden, that's not included in GDP. If you clean your house, that's not included in GDP because it's not things that are sold on a market. Now, the potential confusion though is what happens if I send my kid to daycare? Well, then yes, that's included in GDP. If I'm paying somebody else to watch my kids, that gets included in GDP. If I go to the grocery store and buy vegetables instead of growing them at home, that's included in GDP. If I hire somebody to come and clean my house, that's included in GDP. So you see here, you might say, well, that's a distinction without a difference. And to some extent, I agree with you. That is one, as we're going to talk about later, that's one of the limits of GDP, is that GDP misses a lot of home production. And so it probably does miss a number of goods that should, maybe in theory, should be produced, but we don't really have a way of putting a price on it, right? I mean, what's the price of staying at home and raising your kids? It's hard to put a price on that, right? Right. Zach says it also misses cash paid jobs. Exactly, right? Jobs that are paid under the table are not going to get included in GDP, right? If you pay the neighbor kid to mow your lawn, that's not going to get included in GDP, right? It's just not. Okay, so that's GDP. Now, GDP is a big number, as we're going to talk about here in a minute, in 2020, it's a number that was over $21 trillion. That's such a big number that oftentimes economists find it useful to break GDP up. GDP can be broken up into smaller components. And there's really 3 ways to do this based on the 3 ways or the 3 things that GDP measures. There is a way to break GDP into income components. You can break GDP based on how income is earned. So for instance, and honestly, I'm not going to get into this very much because in this class, we're not going to really find it extremely useful. Well, we will a couple of times, but it's really not useful for us to get into the details of this. But you can break GDP based upon how income is earned. For instance, you can find how much income comes in salaries, how much in wages, how much is earned in terms of interest income. And so you can break GDP based on the different income components of GDP. That is one way you can break down GDP. Another way is you can break GDP into output components. For instance, you can break it down by industry. How much of GDP comes from cars? How much of GDP is from food? How much of it is in haircuts? How much of it is in travel, right? You can, in fact, we'll actually look at an example of this here in a minute, where you can break down GDP based on industry, right? On the actual output that is produced. The third way, and this is the way that we're going to be most we're going to find most useful, and the way we're going to talk the most about here, is to break it down into expenditure components. In other words, break it down by spending. Right? Break it down by spending. So let's talk about this a little bit. How do we break down GDP by spending? And the way to do this can be captured in a simple formula. I hope you guys can't hear. My roofers are blaring some classic rock up there. So I'm hearing the bass line to Led Zeppelin's Rock and Roll. So either you can hear that and you're unhappy, or you cannot hear it and maybe you're happy. So breaking GDP down into its components, and these components can be captured by this equation. Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And you notice I have 3, instead of an equal here, I have 3 lines. What does that mean? That means this is true by definition, right? It's true by definition. In other words, how we define these things makes it true. Y is GDP, and we will always use capital Y to denote GDP in this class. All right, so from here on out, when you see me write a capital Y, I'm talking about GDP. GDP can be broken into these other categories. C, anybody have any idea what C is?
Consumption, yeah.
Consumption, yeah, you got it. Consumption. Consumption. These are consumption goods. honestly, this is the biggest part of GDP. This is about 70% of GDP is consumption goods. You can break consumption into smaller categories. So you can break it up into goods and services. You can break it into durables and non-durables. Basically, the distinction here is a durable is a good that has an expected life of more than a year. So C really captures most of the things that you or I would buy in our lives, right? Most of what we buy in our life would be considered a consumption good of one form or the other. That's why C is such a big component of GDP. And as I said, about 70% of GDP is a consumption good in one form or another, right? So consumption is basically the things that are bought by households, right? When we think of consumption goods, we're basically talking about the things that households purchase. All right, I. Any guesses what I is? Not imports, though that will come later. Not income, because remember, we're measuring expenditure. I keep on jumping in front of you, sorry. Investment, right? Investment. Investment is largely the things that firms and corporations purchase. Investment really has four big categories. And as you're going to see, the key to these categories is, for the most part, these are things that firms purchase. This includes things like factories and equipment. This includes inventories. This includes, very importantly, increasingly importantly, spending by firms on research and development and other forms of intellectual property, which is becoming an increasingly big part of investment for firms. The last component is the only thing that you as an individual might purchase that gets included as investment, and that is new housing. The key here is new housing. It has to be a new house. Then you're contributing the GDP. If you're just selling your old house, you're not contributing the GDP. Okay. So when you think about investment, you have to think about spending by firms, right? It's basically spending by firms and new housing. Of these, you might be surprised to find out that the biggest category in investment is, in fact, research and development and intellectual property, right? And that tells you a lot about the nature of the US economy, that we are increasingly an economy of ideas. That in many ways, what firms make nowadays is ideas, right? You think about some of the biggest companies in the US, whether you're talking about Apple, whether you're talking about Google, whether you're talking about Facebook, whether you're talking about, electric car companies. These are largely about ideas, much more than they are about manufacturing. And so the growth in spending on research and development and intellectual property is really interesting. Inventories is kind of a weird one. Can an apple be an investment good? Well, strangely enough, it can, right? If it's an apple that's sitting in inventory, it is technically an investment until that company sells it, right? So, that's, that's kind of an odd duck in this, but in inventories, anything that's held in inventory is technically an investment. G, what's G? Government purchases. Okay, government purchases is different than government spending. Different than government spending. Government purchases is just spending on goods and services. Okay? It is not all of the transfer payment programs that the government is involved in, like Social Security, welfare, Medicaid, and Medicare, right? Not these kind of programs. Because once again, what are these programs? These programs are basically transferring money from one group of people to another group of people. Nothing is being produced. So in government purchases, we only want to include the actual spending on goods and services. So this is spending on the bureaucracy of government, spending on education, spending on roads and bridges, spending on, as Sunny says, the military, right? Are salaries part of government spending? Yes, because government salaries are providing a service, right? They're a service. So, these are the things that are included, but government purchases is a smaller part of government spending. Government spending is a bigger number because, as we will talk about as we go along in the class, increasingly, this is the part of government spending that's growing the fastest, right? It's these transfer programs that are growing much faster than government purchases. Government purchases have been growing at a very slow trend, while government transfer programs have been growing at a much faster trend. Okay, y equals c plus I plus g, and then finally we get to x minus m. What is x minus m? X is exports, and m is imports. And the difference we'll call the trade balance, or sometimes we'll call it net exports, right? Basically these are synonyms, right? The trade balance or net exports. So this is the contribution of GDP from international trade. Hopefully it's easy to see or easy to understand why exports would be added here, right? Because what happens if we make a computer and sell it to Japan? Well, it doesn't get included in our C plus I plus G, but we did produce it. And so we should add it to GDP, okay? So hopefully it's obvious why exports are added. Why are imports subtracted? Well, imports are subtracted for kind of the opposite reason. What happens if I buy a $100 bottle of French wine? Okay, which, by the way, would absolutely never happen because I am way too cheap. But if I bought a $100 bottle of French wine, how would that impact GDP? Well, when I bought the wine, it would actually first get included as a consumption good. But I don't want it to increase GDP. So what do? I subtract it out here at the end so that the change in GDP is zero. That's why imports are subtracted, right? It's essentially to reduce, to subtract out that portion of consumption or investment or government purchases that are not produced within the US. We know in the US that net exports is less than zero. In other words, we have a pretty significant trade deficit. right? And so, yes, Faith, in the case of the French bottle of wine, that $100 bottle would actually contribute to French GDP. It would not contribute to US GDP. Let's just look at a little bit of data here related to GDP. Just to kind of, you get, I guess, get a little bit more insight into what's going on here with GDP and some of the more maybe subtle changes that we're seeing in GDP here, both over the long term and in the near term. So first off, I just want to kind of give you an idea of how are these different components of GDP, how important are they relatively? So this is looking at GDP in 2020, this pie graph, and you see the consumption is about 70%, a little bit less than 70%. That investment is about 17% of GDP. Government purchases are about 18% of GDP, roughly. And then we have exports and imports. And notice here that imports are bigger than exports, so the difference between them is a negative number, right? One of the biggest changes, though, that we have seen in GDP is this change between the importance of services and the importance of manufactured goods or durable goods. So here we have a graph, hopefully you can see this okay, where the top line, the line that's going up, is the percent of consumption that goes to services. And you can see how dramatically this has risen since 1950. It's essentially doubled from 40% of consumption to almost 80% of consumption now is services. What's gone down? Well, you can see that the dotted line at the bottom, which is durable goods, has been basically flat. It's gone down a little bit, but it's been basically flat. What we are buying less of is durable goods. That durable goods have fallen dramatically as a percent of GDP. And so, when we talk about the decline in manufacturing in the United States, many people talk about the decline in manufacturing as if it's only the fault of China. China's screwing us over again. They're taking all of our jobs. Unfortunately, that is not the situation. The situation is we simply don't consume as many manufactured goods as we used to, relative to everything else. That more and more we are a service-based economy, that we simply don't spend as much money on manufactured goods. That tells us why there has been this dramatic decline in manufacturing, right? It's not that another country is doing it to us, it's because our spending habits have changed, right? That we are spending less and less on durable goods and more on services. And, this is, I think this is one of the more dramatic changes in the US economy, right?
I have a question. Sorry. If a company, does it change if there's like tax write-offs from the government? Like if the investment portion, would it then get put under like government spending? Like, or like, I guess not, but like, how does that work? Because like if a company goes and buys X amount of like warehouses and then they get tax write-offs or whatever, does that change or no? Like, what?
No, so the tax write-offs, I mean, there's accounting profits is something in what things are valued at accounting wise is something completely different than what GDP is. GDP is just looking at the market value, right? So for instance, what's the market value of how much these companies spent on building those factories and warehouses? That's what gets included in GDP. So now what you pay for in taxes, that's a separate question, but that's not a question that's related to GDP directly. Okay. So, as I said, this movement from manufacturing to a service-based economy is also closely tied to this idea that we are becoming an ideas economy, right? That more and more what we spend money on is ideas. And ideas are a big part of the service-based economy, right? So, you know, you think about this, like, for instance, in some sense, I'm the classic example of this, right? I work, what do I provide? Services. But what's the real service I'm providing? Well, I'm being a college professor and hopefully providing you guys with a good education and transferring ideas, right? And more, our economy is really, that's becoming the dominant aspect of what our economy is. And so, you know, we'll talk about this transition as we go forward, but oftentimes this transition does not reflect the political discussion that's going on. That, you know, the political discussion is somehow somebody's to blame for the decline in manufacturing. Instead, it's just more of an evolution that what we want to spend money on is changing. Let me show you just the most recent data on GDP, and then we can call it a morning. Okay, can everybody see my screen here? Can I see my screen? Okay, first off, let's look at what's happened to GDP here over the last couple of years. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow when we talk about actually measuring GDP. But usually we express GDP as a growth rate, as a percentage change from year to year. This is looking at a percentage change from quarter to quarter, but you can see the dramatic fluctuation we have had here in GDP. These are some of the biggest percent changes in GDP that we've had in US history. This 25% decline in GDP in quarter two of 2020 was the largest single quarter decline in GDP in US history. Of course, that was then matched with the largest increase in GDP in US history, right? And so COVID has definitely wreaked some havoc on our GDP statistics, right? Most economists are expecting very, very strong GDP growth rates here for the first part of 2021. So we do not have the data from the first quarter of 2021 that will be coming out very shortly. But, you know, economists expect some very big positive changes as we essentially catch up from COVID. What industries have done the best and done the worst? So this is really breaking GDP based on output. If you break GDP down based on output, you can actually look at which industries have suffered the most and which industries have actually gained. And so you see a lot of losses in, obviously, accommodation and food services, arts and entertainment. State and local governments have had to spend less. Retail trade, mining, all of these things have experienced fairly significant losses. What's done well? You know, agriculture, forestry, surprisingly, utilities. The federal government has spent a lot more on COVID relief. Finance and insurance has done very well. That's an interesting question as to why that is. And then, of course, you know, the continued growth in the information economy, right? One of the things we know is that COVID has really only exacerbated or magnified this movement to an information-based economy, right? As we are doing more and more of our shopping and our living online. And so you can just see that in the data. If you go down and look at the data based on the expenditure equation, and I apologize, this is a very, very hard table to kind of read online, but let's just look at this first column here that says that it has 2020 under it. This just gives you the size of GDP in the US in 2020. And the size of GDP was $20,936 billion, or just a little bit short of $21 trillion. $21 trillion was how big GDP was, the size of the US economy. And then you can look and see how much this is broken down based on all those expenditure components. So for instance, C is personal consumption's expenditure, which was about, what is it, $14.1 trillion. And you can break that down into durable goods and non-durable goods and services, etc. Then there's investment, which is about $3.6 trillion. And you can break that down into different categories, right? If we move to the second page here, then there's government purchases, right? Government purchases. And they have it broken between the federal government and state and local governments. And then finally, net exports, right? Exports and imports. So I'm just kind of skimming through this, but if you can actually go to the BEA.org, I'm sorry, BEA.gov, because it's the Bureau of Economic Analysis that collects this data, and you can look through all of this GDP data at will, right? And you can see this broken down into smaller and smaller increments. The government's ability to collect all this data is really one of the, a massive achievement, right? That has not only improved the study of economics, but it's really improved the study of government and governance and how we actually know what we know about how government and how the economy works. And so it's been a massive undertaking. That's not to say that GDP is perfect, though. And that's really where we want to pick up with the story tomorrow, right? Is talk a little bit more about how exactly we measure GDP, do some examples of calculating GDP, but then talk about some of the limits of GDP, what GDP can tell us and what it can't. But we will do that tomorrow. This afternoon, we'll meet back here at 12:30. Like I said, I want to spend a little bit of time reviewing what we talked about yesterday and today and getting ready for the quiz, and then we will take the quiz. All right? Okay, anybody have any quick questions before I let you go for lunch? Okay, well, have a good lunch, and we'll see you back here all at 12:30, okay?
Awesome, thank you.
All right, see you guys.